then we can get kicked off.
Okay. Today we have a team of researchers from the Mayo Clinic presenting results of their research, which for several years I knew that Davide Sottara and his colleagues working on very interesting clinical decision support systems, where they apply different knowledge representation rules and inference techniques. And because this is very practical system, I tried to persuade Davide to join DecisionCAMP and tell us about their results. And finally, this year, they decided to share these results. So this is a long-awaited presentation. And Davide, in spite of COVID, I hope it will be very interesting, and I wish you to get well as soon as possible. Okay, take over.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind words. I have to bring a bit of context. Yes, our team in Mayo has been working on situational awareness, medical cognitive support for a few years, and this work is still ongoing. That's why we don't really have a final deliverable presentation yet. And today I'm going to focus on one aspect of the broader application. So maybe this is a way of saying we will come back next year with an even bigger presentation. Today is really about decision making at the point of care when it comes to managing typically patient conditions. So we're not necessarily in an emergency state, but there are choices to be made about how to treat a patient, how to make them better in some sense. And to this end, we have built a socio-technical system that combines machine-driven decisions with human-computer interaction to try to balance the ability to compute, to use technology, including AI and all other techniques, but also be closer to and in alignment with how our physicians think. That's our pattern. I will start with a basic definition of clinical decision support. I mean, decision-making applied to healthcare. And to highlight that when it comes to support, we need to keep in mind a few different aspects. Who the audience is. Different decision makers have different background knowledge, cognition abilities, information awareness. So we need to tailor what we advise to their ability to receive it. It has to be in context, because the right time, the right setting, the right information for the right purpose gives the right advice, which makes things better. And to that end, we need that situation intelligence, which is about understanding the context in which a decision is made, so that the content we present is actually suitable, targeted to that particular purpose. And of course, it's a noble mission. We are trying to get people's lives better. The problem is that if we look at how clinical decision support, CDS, has been formalized, if you talk to some people in the healthcare communities, they will say, oh, it's rules. Well, yes, it is and it isn't. It's all kinds of rules that derive from each other and relate to each other. But if we look at those from a rule semantics perspective, we realize that the properties, the computational characteristics are pretty different. And I've seen a lot of discussion even this week on different flavors and styles of decision making. Well, this is pertinent and applicable. The recommendations, as we know them from the guidelines, they really derive typically from evidence-based medicine, which gives us facts. Out of the facts, the policies, the deontic rules are derived. And when the deontic rules are further concretized, that's how we get to recommendation rules, which try to guide and advise on how to actually act without acting directly. The step of complete automation, I know this patient should be on a drug, let's put them on a drug, never happens, never flies in healthcare. There's always some level of interaction with a human that is necessary. That is why the policy to automation is instead replaced by some kind of interaction mechanism where we need to deliver the recommendation, which is about what the system thinks is a good way to make a decision without actually making the decision. The human, the physician, and the patient, usually together, are the decision makers. So anything that helps around it, like triggered CDS, now we can listen for particular events to deliver a recommendation. Any follow-up automation that may follow the approval of a decision to be made. And the measure, was the action actually following the decision that was made or not? Was there deviation, an unexpected exception? Do we need compensations? All of those are complementary to the key aspect, which will be today's discussion, which is this recommendation rule, an interlocutionary rule, which is about communicating what is thought to be a good decision to make. It's not surprising that healthcare has a lot of healthcare standards. This is more for background reference. Most of the healthcare reference standards deal with ECA rules, so automation around collection of data that may be used to make a recommendation, and then deliver this message about it. It's interesting that these ECA rules are, again, in the formalism understanding, more a situation where the action of the rules is really delivering a message, not actually changing medical record, placing an order. So what we did is we asked our physicians and our patients, what does a recommendation look like for you to be able to understand what the recommendation is about, where it comes from, and review it, consider it, accept it, reject it, discuss it, and move on. So we created a content model, abstract content model. Again, in hindsight, nothing surprising, where the strategic guidance is really the actual recommendation being made. And the context in which the guidance is put is a combination of the input data that led to the selection of that particular guidance to be the one that is recommended. Background information that tells us where the choice of guidance comes from, as well as context in terms of applicability. What problem are we trying to solve? And is it a scenario where that problem is solvable? So to further discuss this, what we can do is we can think of the actionable insight as a notional interpretation in terms of decision model. The idea is we have a clinical question. Should my patient be anticoagulated? Or what kind of anticoagulant should I put my patient on, given that I have decided previously that they should be anticoagulated? That clinical question can be answered in different ways. So yes, anticoagulant, no, don't. The question, what anticoagulant should I put them on, should be warfarin versus an oral anticoagulant. The guidance is really looking back to the evidence-based medicine and or the institutional policies and say, in this situation, if the applicability criteria is met, otherwise we're talking about nothing. Given the input data, given what we know about the patient and their situation and their preference, their social determinants, anything we know about them, of course, their disease, their progression, their states, their goals. Given that information, can we identify what option is best for them? And identifying that option is really what now we need to communicate in a way that makes it explainable, transparent, and consumable to the person that is receiving that recommendation. So we almost have, not almost, we do have a dual interpretation of the notion of insight. There's the insight as the rules that tells us what data should be used to identify the recommendation to be made. And then the recommendation as an insight, how to regurgitate this information back to the physicians and have them understand not only what the recommendation we're making, what the strength is in the deontic sense, should, could, must, as well as the justification, the reasons why that particular insight is given as opposed to a different insight. The idea is that for any one clinical questions, there may be different alternative strategic guidances, each one of which is a different recommendation that is suitable to a different patient context. So the question was, okay, we can formalize and compute in different flavors of sophistication what the rule is. We can use triggers to determine when is the right time to make that recommendation and deliver that insight. The logic is classic decision logic. Yes, it can benefit from machine learning techniques, can benefit from probabilistic reasoning, deontic reasoning, all kind. And we have more work to discuss and collaborate for the future presentation. But today, the focus was, let's assume we have identified what the suitable recommendation is. How do we deliver it in a contextual, consumable, naturalistic way that a human physician can accept, think about, and gain information out? And the classic approaches were not great. We could have linked to some content. That's what most EHR, well, several EHR systems do, so text to be read. The problem is content that is not contextualized is not very informative or takes an extra burden cognitively to map the output of the computation to, which is very specific, to the general knowledge that would be in some kind of textbook background information. Can we construct the explanations or the whole message? The problem is we're not just looking at an explanation, we're looking at the full delivery of a contextual piece of information that is setting the reason and aligns to what we know about the patient and what the physician should do in a given setting based on evidence and context. So to construct a message would be incredibly laborious and just not doable. And natural language generation, yeah, we looked into that. It's still too much of a higher bar for us, not reliable to the level of healthcare and not at the cost for that reliability we are able to afford. So we went for a trade-off solution where the intent was to allow the customization of content in a declarative way. Yes, we looked into templating languages like velocity and things like that, but we wanted something that was declarative, not imperative, did not involve programmatic manipulation of algorithmic manipulation of text, but had something that could be formalized a little bit. And to that extent, our solution ended up being DITA, the Darwin Information Typing Architecture. DITA is a semantic markup language, so along the lines of HTML, but at a higher level of abstraction, which allows to organize the human readable content, not only from a presentation perspective, but also from a content type and content model perspective. It literally allows to separate the text or media into sections and attribute a role and a function to each section so that that piece of content can be interpreted interpreted and used accordingly. It also has a lot of opportunities for modularity and reuse. The core function of DITA is to allow the composition, decomposition, recomposition of content. It's multi-channel, so it serves hypermedia, text, PDF, printable books, voice, text to voice, all kinds of delivery from the same content. So it's platform agnostic in a literal way. And just to disclose a little bit of business, our enterprise has adopted a content management system, which is literally based on DITA on its internals. So this presented a great opportunity to use our content, which is already developed for decision making that is not context and situation aware. We have a lot of applications that are more research, guideline based, offline kind of applications, guideline oriented, that offer us content which we could take and with simple annotations restructure in a way that made it possible to deliver in a contextual way. And let me explain how we did it. The idea of DITA is that in general, you can have a composition of elements, fragments. And a DITA map is the composite structure organizer that points to the various elements. And a DITA map allows us to link DITA topics, and each DITA topics represent maps to the content model of the insight. And inside an insight topic, we are able to tag semantically the fragments, which consist in the guidance, in the data, in the info, all the different bits and pieces that constitute the different elements. So on one end, we have the content that has been curated by the editors and designed for the specific audiences. And on the other hand, we have the metadata, which tells us what is the role of each piece of fragment of the content and how it should be used, how it should be delivered. Additionally, and here is where the contextualization comes in, DITA offers us out of the box two capabilities. One is the ability to inject specific data elements, so Mad Libs style. We have an ability, so this is a small snippet of an example where I can have a section, which is essentially one of the fragments of in the DITA markup tree. And this section is of type actionable insight input. So this is a fragment of our content model. And inside this input, this is where we display the patient data, which led to the decision. And to do that, we can use a combination of static text that provides context and content, as well as dynamic text. So this PH keyref is a placeholder, is a variable essentially, that we can substitute with a value that has been determined at the time the piece of content is contextualized, individualized. So formally, I mean, without too much ado, this is literally a replacement of textual elements. More interesting, the other capability that DITA offers us is the notion of conditional formatting. Conditional formatting allows to use metadata to determine what fragments, what pieces of content are suitable, pertinent, and/or relevant in certain contexts of delivery. So DITA out of the box has the notion of audience. We can tag certain elements to be expert-oriented and other pieces of content to be more general. So that gives us the ability at delivery time to know who are we delivering to. Am I delivering to an expert? So can I show the more advanced content and hide the part that is more backend information that everybody in that field knows? Or vice versa, because I'm not talking to an expert, still talking to a physician, but I need to, or a patient maybe, I need to provide additional background content that would help explain and understand why a certain recommendation is made. And second, the notion of props. This is a general purpose capability of DITA, and this is where we used it in a specific way. Our architecture uses props to essentially formalize relevance rules. The pattern we expressed here, for example, is essentially a predicate logic expression that can be interpreted as if true, the piece of content is relevant in the context in which it would be delivered. So in this example, this particular text is relevant if the birth sex is female and or they have a risk score of 0 or 1. So this pattern obviously can be matched to the data that comes from the context, patient context. And if matching, we would infer relevance and so keep the content. If not matching, we would infer not relevance, and a policy would be, for example, to remove the irrelevant content. So what we get is essentially that best of both worlds. We have a way to use content that has been authored by people that author content for a living, using the tools, using the capabilities that are pertinent to their work. And Mayo Clinic is blessed because we do have a health and content education section that is completely dedicated to the curation of content that is meant for physicians and patients alike. That content now can be annotated, and annotated because it is already cast in a way, in a schema, in a structural markup that has semantic characteristics, which allows us to declare on the content when, who, where, how that content is relevant, and use relevance to implement policies such as hide, show, remove completely, to manipulate the content, essentially based on the semantic notion of relevance. And the idea is that the matching of those semantic annotations can now happen against data that is inferable and inferred using classic decision-making techniques of any kind. So the general idea is our decision models do not make the actual decision. They understand enough of the patient context to be able to assess the state, identify the candidate recommendations, and identify whether or not any one of those recommendations are actually applicable and fungible. And we use that information to deliver those recommendations. So if you look at a notional process, this is a BPMN just for the sake of highlighting the idea, but not necessarily executed as such. When we want to deliver this kind of naturalistic insights, we still query the medical record to get what we know about the patient. And we apply some inferences to assess several things. What happens, maybe again, another talk for another day. We identify the patient state in terms of disease and progressions, identify the patient goals as set by themselves or the physicians, identify any care gaps between the state and the goal, and then use that information to identify what options, what insights have the ability to address those gaps. And if those insights are applicable because of resource preference and other determinants that may make certain things moot points. The whole idea of defeasibility, because yes, this is good in theory, but it does not apply here, is also valid. That's what the precondition is about. But if we have an applicable scenario where we have insights, which really are human readable, informal descriptions of what could have an action semantics, we are then able to identify and contextualize, tailor that action semantics, not necessarily addressing a computable form, but working on the human readable curated form using a declarative templating approach. So data templates that contain patterns such as this are loaded and matched on a patient-by-patient basis to what we know about the patient, and use the pattern matching technique to understand if the piece of content, the insight as a whole, is applicable or not. If it is applicable, we deliver it. And if it is applicable, we further refine it by tweaking, tailoring the specific pieces of the content that may be further adjusted based on patient data. And finally, at that point, we can deliver the insight, and that is delivered through a channel as a human-oriented message. Again, closing the loop, accepting the recommendation, and executing on the action semantics is something that happens later. The problem here is to inform the physician of what are the options, not in general, they know the guidelines, they know medicine, but what options are possible, admissible for the patient, given what we know about the patient, and further add cautions, notices, additional information. Have you considered that this patient is pregnant? Have you please keep in mind that this patient risk score is elevated, risk of, I don't know, developing an unwanted consequence. So that gives us the flexibility of how to combine what we want to communicate with what we want to, what we can compute. Because here's the problem. Besides the obvious ability to say, okay, I'm trying to partially solve the problem of delivering a message to a very sophisticated audience. So constructing and crafting very targeted messages. Besides that, we have a number of challenges up front on the decision making. As much as medical decision making is complex and usually requires some non-deterministic forms such as Bayesian networks and other kind of probabilistic, fuzzy, and perfect uncertain reasoning. The real challenge, the most infamous problem, even today for most healthcare organizations, is the quality of the data. One of the main drivers where we shifted to this soft approach is that we could not make the computable decisions, not only because we couldn't by policy. FDA does not appreciate a complete automation of patient decision making. But the challenge has been the data was not good enough, ever. Data is missing, data is not available because it's not captured ever. To capture the data would cost fatigue. Is it worthwhile to ask a physician or a patient to fill one more questionnaire so that we can make a trivial recommendation? Maybe, maybe not. So we literally backed off from the ambition to always assume to be able to make complete decisions. Of course, in some cases we can, and we do, but in general have the ability to make weaker decisions, which are not taking us to the last mile because we can't, but can take us as far as the data and the inference machinery we have allow, and then push everything else into the human computer interaction space. So what does it translate to? One case is the necessity for graceful value handling. It's typical to not have data. And the idea is, if we have data, we can use it, we can contextualize, we can present it. If we don't, what do we do? To deal with that, the conditional formatting example here tells us, okay, if we can determine the birth sex of the patient, well, let's trivially remark it, maybe because it does have an impact on certain procedures and medications or risk assessments. If we can't, let's be clear about it. Let's say unable to determine, please take corrective actions to fill the gap yourself, the physician typically asking the patient, talking to each other. Formally, what this means is we structure these DEC attributes. So the properties, the predicates, essentially, to have a domain that is predefined and is known to be an enumerator partition. And we use null as the explicit way to handle missing, unable to infer data. And we use other as a special value for closure, which means we could tell what the sex is, not any one of the relevant ones that may impact the decision to be made. This is again about giving control and reducing, trying to use the data that we have and the logic we have to infer these characteristics, these features of the patient to a point that we can use to drive the next level of interaction, but always have a fallback option. We cannot make the determination in this case. Let the content be honest about that inability, surface that, and call it out as something that the physician and the patient need to deal with, possibly without the extra burden of informing the computer. Again, it actually is one of the biggest problems in health IT to have to balance the documentation with the gain coming out of the documentation. When in the clinical workflow, the physicians and the patient will go and actually write to the medical record the information they acquired during the visit, usually happens at a later time than when the patient sees the doctor. And that creates a temporal mismatch in when the data would actually be available versus be needed for decision making. And that is why this option of always assume that the data is not there is something that surfaced to a first-class citizen in this framework. And of course, the second very similar related issue is what if the data is not available ever? Because this institution does not capture the data, we don't have the machinery. When we look at the clinical guidelines, the one that are published by the societies, if any of you has ever done it, otherwise I'll trust me on this one. A lot of the guidelines propose deontic rules that are not computable. They're not computable because the criteria is so fuzzy and so contextual that to be able to answer that question using data, which means without asking somebody to enter something in a form, is simply not doable. And a lot of times, those guidelines are not computerized. Any attempt to do offline non-interactive decision support just ignores those guidelines, those parts of the guidelines, because they're not computable. So what we can do using a simple logic trick is, okay, let's pretend that your original guidelines said there's some context and you, so something that is not easily computable, not computable at all. Patient is upset, patient is frail, patient has concerns. Anything like that for which there's not really a computable way to solve, we can push that aspect into the inside. So essentially, instead of failing at saying if the patient has a certain condition and is scheduled for surgery and is frail, provide guidance about considering alternative therapeutic options, we can say in this scenario, your insight should be do the surgery, but consider the alternative options if the patient is frail. Now, delivery, exact wordsmithing is not my job, so don't hold me verbatim on that. But the idea is things that cannot be computed can be pushed easily into the message, and using conditional formatting, be able to rule out that consideration or rule in depending on whether the consideration is needed. Because if we are actually able to compute frailty and determine frailty, we can choose the piece of text that pertains to frail patients and hide the one that pertains to we don't know if a patient is frail or not. And with this combination, the computation of the message is computable. So we can run this logic and craft the as much as insightful as possible message in a completely automated way. And it's really at the reception, at the recipient time, that the message will inform and explain what was recommended and try to justify with supporting evidence and pertinent data why a certain recommendation is made, and let the physician take it from there. Also because, again, any actual decision when it comes to care has to be reviewed by the physician and the patient, and only then taken back to the workflow, typically in the electronic medical record, to which connection, well, that's yet another talk for another day. So this is an example of what I was trying to address. Let's say that we don't know if frailty can be assessed, or we know that frailty cannot be assessed at all. A scenario where frailty can be assessed can lead to a recommendation that is worded like, because this patient is frail, do this and that. Now we can also, and I probably have not stressed this enough, use the semi-formality of natural language. Clinical guidelines have deontic semantics, are expressed in natural language, but have semi-formal control language conventions that guides how the text is actually written by the professionals and can be tied to the implicit computation semantics that will follow. So this, do that is actually more likely to sound consider doing this action, consider as a weak deontic recommendation, because there is strong evidence, and that will lead to statistics that have quantifiable elements about cost-benefit ratio of performing that action in a certain cohort versus what not, which is, again, yet another way of saying that this, what I'm presenting today, is actually framed in a broader, bigger context, which we are almost but not quite ready to present completely publicly. So hold on with me, maybe for 2023. But back to the context formatting. The idea is if we cannot determine the frailty, we don't have a predictive model that looks at the patient gait and their eating habits and their Fitbit data. If we cannot determine that, we push the frailty question on the physician, and the physician can observe the patient, can shake their hands, talk to them, and use that information to determine whether or not what we recommend here, again, consider doing this or that, is actually meaningful or should be just ignored. At this point, the benefits to our framework were already enough. So benefits in terms of, on one end, the ability to reuse content which is authored by people using content in an enterprise framework. The ability to use also enterprise decision-making computation techniques that are not expected to take, and actually never required, to take the decision-making to the last mile, but take it as far as they can in terms of the computational capabilities and the data that is available. Again, data quality, a big problem. And also no further than allowed FDA regulation on what is software as a medical device versus decision support as very clean barrier on how far computation can go autonomously without human supervision. So that balance allowed us to inject and marry the decision-making with the content manipulation in a very declarative approach, which then also allowed us to enable the implementation of some validation and verification techniques. The underlying idea is that the DITA markup is based on an XML3, and the annotation properties are essentially predicate logic expressions. And the ability to flatten every branch of a tree and take all the predicates along that tree to give us the expression that pertains to that particular branch. That expression can be checked for the usual suspects, can be checked for consistency. Did we use filter upstream, so show this content only for female patients, and then downstream as a subnode, we have content that only applies to male patients. Okay, so that's obviously something that implies an inconsistency or essentially a bug or a mishandled intent. We can use that logic to understand under what circumstances a particular piece of content would be actually presented or not. So can we do satisfiability and completeness checks? We can, under the assumption that we keep that logic very simple, as I presented it, conjunction of disjunctive predicate. So very simple normal form that is tractable and is targetable by the decision making. And finally, also redundancy. So simplify things. We use this technique to realize that we have several options in certain cases to simplify the criteria, which led to a simplification of decision rules, which led to a simplification of the data to be pulled. So overall optimization of the entirety of the process. So with that, I will save a couple of minutes for discussions. I will take any questions. I'll go off camera to pull up the application so we can see what that piece looks like. I do need a minute do that. So we'll
Okay,
stop my
thank
share.
you. Thank you, Davide. This is very interesting. I'm seeing a lot of potential applications in non-clinical applications too. It's just like anything where you have a knowledge worker who might be making a different kind of decision based on the context of the decision. There would be similar kinds of techniques that could be applied.
Absolutely. The medical field stressed that need to the extreme because of two main reasons. As I said, well, one is sad, the other one is not. The data quality problem, which is one of the major challenges that the whole industry is still trying to tackle. And the second problem is the FDA regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're familiar or not, there are strong limits on how far a decision can be done without without hitting legal constraints.
How similar is that in other countries? I'm in Canada, for example, but it's there. Do we have similar kinds of laws across a wide number of countries?
I am not completely sure about the legislation, but I know for sure that ethics should be even more important than norms.
Yes.
The problem is, can a computer alone make a decision on whether or not I should be on a drug therapy?
Right, right.
Without asking me or my doctor and putting me on the plan automatically. So I see
so the idea
drugs.
of recommendations makes more sense where you're still leaving the final decision in the hands of the doctor.
Yeah, and the intent is not to do a recommendation in the classic decision support, put the patient on this drug. It's really surface what the guideline and the policies, we call them care process models, clinical pathways, have put in place for a patient in this situation on a population basis. These are the things that should be considered. On an individual basis, these are the additional things that should be considered. How do we marry them together to be consistent?
Okay.
So let me show what the application looks like for a second.
Share your screen.
Yep.
He's just getting the application going, I think. So there we go.
This is test data. I had to go through a couple of things I cannot necessarily show, but anyway. This is our broader application, not a real patient, no PHI, so don't be worried about that. This is a full model-driven BPMN, CMMN, DMN driven application with FHIR standards, again, for another day. But this banner up here, for example, is an example of how that particular contextualization shows up. We have the actual guidance. Warfarin is indicated. Notice that we don't say put the patient on warfarin. The warfarin is indicated, and there's reasons. The patient is one of those that have atrial fibrillation and a mechanical valve prosthesis. Okay. We are able to provide additional patient context. So this patient is already taking warfarin, actually Coumadin, 6 milligrams, and so on. So the idea is the recommendation at this point is to review and see if this particular type of anticoagulation dose amount route is still the best. And then the additional supporting information, this is a content that is reused from our educational material, which is presented, this particular piece, not necessarily individualized, but is presented as supporting information that justifies to a non-expert why we're making these designations. The other caveat is this notion of contextualization does not only apply to insights. So the idea of slicing and dicing the content based on context applies to any kind of content. But the recommendation content was a primary use case because of that sensitivity of the decision being made. So I will happily take any questions if there are any.
I'm not seeing any at this point, but if you want to check back on Slack, maybe later when you're feeling a little better, it's there.
Yep.
There might be some in there. You've I can't believe you kind of did a presentation feeling the way you're feeling. So I just had a booster shot yesterday, so I feel kind of crappy, but I'm sure it's nothing compared to how you're doing. So
They're comparable. I'm actually lucky. Yesterday it hit my throat, so yesterday I could not speak. I wasn't feeling bad, but literally I was completely voiceless. So thankfully it was scheduled for today.
yes, that would not have been good for a presentation. So,
but anyway,
thank you very much, Davide, and get well.
Absolutely, I will, and I will keep checking all the other fantastic presentations and reach out as
looking forward for your new results next year.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.